Some extremes to invite some self-examination today.
Welcome to Coffee with Creamer, where you get to sit down with our host, Dr. Barry Creamer, for a conversation about faith, life, and culture. We'll look at old ideas through a new lens, turn those culture wars on their head, and paint a picture of the way things could be. If you like your thinking deep and your coffee hot, pull up a chair. You're in the right place.
As extreme as the environment of our current world, it's not new to us. Political bifurcations are obvious, and the catastrophism, the belief that all things are coming to an apocalyptic conclusion, some of which is understandable in the sense that, occasionally semi or quasi-apocalyptic circumstances actually do arise. Europe did crash into a self-destructive spiral in the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, and it's worth recognizing that the rest of the world got pulled into that as well. So it's worth noticing when things seem to go awry that there may be something really wrong. So I'm fine. We have some extremes going on right now, but they're not new. It's never been the case in the world that there are not threats and dangers that we're alerted to and then we have to react to, and sometimes those lead to catastrophic consequences. So I'm not trying to minimize anything, but I do want to pause for long enough to say that while in the same way that we are more inclined to look judgmentally on someone else than we are to look judgmentally on ourselves, with a few exceptions where there's some psychological therapy probably required. The reality is it's easier to judge other people than it is to judge ourselves. In that exact same way, it's easier to see the problems in everything else in the world than it is to see the problems in ourselves. And so I thought I would take a few instances of extremes that I've been exposed to recently or lately, and use those as an opportunity to turn the finger pointing back at myself. And hopefully, as you consider it, you will look at the option to examine yourself in light of it. So some extremes, but then for the purpose of inviting some self-examination and some tools. And I don't mean by that a long, complicated list of deep embedded tools that you could use to improve yourself, but just a few little suggestions at the end for how we might be able to see past the extremes or within the extremes to examine ourselves a little more closely. So what I want to do first is give it some historical perspective by looking at an older case of extremism. And something I've mentioned not too long ago in a previous episode from a reading I did in Empire of the Summer Moon, a book I told you about before with Quanah Parker and the history of the Comanche Nation and so on. I'm not going to rehash all of that, but I do want to point this out, that when Texas became a nation, so this historically, this extremism that we're talking about now has always been around. And in Texas, it has pretty much always had the flavor of this anti-immigrant or anti-foreigner sort of approach versus a more conciliatory and peacemaking approach. There's just always been that division. And a part of it originated, and this is what the Empire of the Summer Moon addresses, that book, part of it originally was about the Native Americans, the Indians, as they were referred to, who lived in Texas before and lived all over the Great Plains of the United States, in particular the Comanches. And so anyway, when the nation was being formed of Texas, the Republic of Texas, in 1836, It was formed in the context of, being a frontier area. East Texas was being settled a little more rapidly than everywhere else, just as it is now. West Texas is more sparsely populated than East Texas is. It was the same way, and so there were the confrontations that happened on the frontier areas between the Indians, the Native Americans, and then the settlers, who were always expanding, always looking for the next piece of property to capitalize on. And it's just, that's how it happens. Expansion occurs. And so while that's going on, there are people who are wanting to be peaceful, to offer peace, to try to promote civility in the relationship with these different peoples than we had known before, among the indigenous people of the area. And then there were the people who just wanted to kill them all because they had had some bad experiences with them, and some legitimately really bad experiences with them. So I understand where they were coming from. But I want to give the contrast in terms of the first two administrations of the, 10-year-long or 9-year-long Texas Republic from 1836 to 1845, when it became a state, obviously. So the first president of, the Republic of Texas was Sam Houston, obvious hero of the Battle of San Jacinto and the man that took the surrender from Santa Anna after the Battle of San Jacinto, which was a very brief battle apparently, and so on. Anyway, all of that Texas history, and if you don't, you can go learn it from someone who knows a lot more about it than I do. But when Sam Houston became president, in his inaugural address, he made this point about how we ought to deal with the Indians, as they're referred to in this quotation from him, in our relationship with them, in the Texans, the new, Republic of Texas, relationship with the Indians who were already in the land and who had already perpetrated some pretty nasty crimes, along with having been violated in some pretty nasty ways by treaties that were not kept and so on. I mean, you know a lot of that history as well, I'm sure. And so I just want to read to you a little bit of his inaugural address. Here's Sam Houston, 1836, Columbia, Texas. I got it from the Columbia Historical Museum. Daisy will create a link for you if you want to go look at it. It's not long. But the section that I took out is this. A subject of no, he starts talking about, quote, a subject of no small importance is the situation of an extensive frontier bordered by Indians and open to their depredations. So they've experienced some of the harshness of the relationship. He goes on, treaties of peace and amity and the maintenance of good faith with the Indians present themselves to my mind as the most rational grounds on which to obtain their friendship. Let us abstain, on our part, from aggressions, establish commerce with the different tribes, supply their useful and necessary wants, maintain even-handed justice with them, and natural reason will teach them the utility of our friendship. He goes on to say this. Now, you can hear, he's completely conciliatory. Let's make peace, and let's show them why it's so valuable to them to engage in this kind of trade with us for their benefit and ours, and not just make enemies of everyone. Now, he's not pretending that everything about being a new nation is going to be all olive branches and peace. He says next, the very next words, not quite the next words, but close. Admonished by the past, we cannot, in justice, disregard our national enemies. Now, he just got finished with the war, with Mexico, and the revolution against Mexico to become independent and establish themselves as a nation. So he's talking about Mexican enemies. So he says, admonished by the past, we cannot, in justice, disregard our national enemies. And then he talks about how vigilance is going to be important. Having a disciplined and valiant army will ensure their discomfiture, that we'll be able to handle the enemies. And then he goes on and says this, the course our enemies have pursued has been opposed to every principle of civilized warfare. Bad faith, inhumanity, and devastation marked their path of invasion. He's describing the win at San Jacinto and their victory as an army, the Texans. He says, we were a little band contending for liberty. They were thousands. They were also sleeping, by the way, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. They were having their siesta. But whatever the case, we were few, they were thousands, and they were well appointed and munitioned and provisioned, seeking to rivet chains upon us or extirpate us from the earth. Their cruelties have incurred the universal denunciation of Christendom. Now, I just want to take Sam Houston's words for a moment and make a point about the point he's making. Sam Houston, this is the guy, the giant white statue on I-45 going down toward Houston, just south of Huntsville, right? Huge hero of the state. No surprise, I mean, he's the first president of the republic. This man is not foreign to war. He understands the importance of using physical force when it has to be used. So he says we need an army, but we need a disciplined and valiant army. Keep this in mind as we talk about the second president of the Republic of Texas in just a moment, in the extreme on the other side. So his point is to say I'm inferring something that I think is implicit in the way he juxtaposes those two ideas, because it was not a mystery. In early Texas, the great political conflict was, what are you going to do about the Indian problem? What are you going to do about these raids that are coming on the frontier? What are you going to do about protecting us and making us safe and expanding our territory? And how are you going to handle that? And so his answer is, well, let's do it peaceably. I mean, if we make a treaty, let's keep the treaty, which would have been a novel idea in American exchanges with the indigenous people from here. But he's saying, well, let's do that. Let's make treaties and show them why it would be valuable to have a relationship, and we won't pretend that we're not going to have national enemies that we have to defend against. We will have a disciplined and valiant army, but they will be disciplined and valiant, not something that would be condemned by all of Christianity for how we treat our enemies, because our enemies had treated us that way, and they had. They had given no quarter. Even when surrender was offered, they had slaughtered the people who had surrendered. So Sam Houston is saying that's evil. We can't be that way. So we're not going to be that way. We're going to have a disciplined and valiant army. And regarding the Indians that we're going to interact with, as he said it, we're going to do it by establishing treaties and offering economic exchange and making peace with them, and then treating them like other human beings. If they do something wrong, then we punish the people who does something wrong. But we don't go against everyone. That's his idea. Okay. That's one extreme. And listen, there were a lot of people in Texas who had experienced on the western frontier at the time, which was around where I'm sitting right now. So it was moving from East Texas toward the west and just passing through the areas that we would think of, Dallas, Fort Worth, all that area, up towards Wichita Falls. That's all frontier area during this time. And so they had some brutalities. I'm not talking about, oh, we had a fight over some land and the Indians took our property again. I'm talking about slaughtering men, women, and children and cutting open people and, just bad. I'm not going to go into all the details. You can imagine, and you've seen plenty of movies, Westerns, all that kind of stuff to make the point, or read plenty of Western novels to get to the image. And if you haven't, man, there's some rough stuff out there you can read to get really a good idea historically of how brutal it was. Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, stands as one example. So thank you, Winston Hotman, for the reference to that book, by the way, which it is a brilliant piece of literature. It's not pretty. It's not easy to read, but it is a brilliant piece of literature. Anyway, the point back to this is that Sam Houston can say all of this, but to the people whose families had been slaughtered, you can imagine that they're saying, what are you talking about? These are not people who have walked up to us and said, hey, would you like an even exchange? These are people who have slaughtered our families. So I can understand why people would look at Sam Houston and think, what a dove. Why is he acting this way, as if we're going to find peace here? Our families are going to continue to be destroyed if we don't do something stronger than this. So Sam Houston takes his approach for a couple of years and then loses in an election to Mirabeau B. Lamar. This matters to me. Mirabeau B. Lamar, that's my school. I went to high school at M.B. Lamar High School in Arlington, Texas. Mirabeau B. Lamar High School. Hi to any of my friends out there who went to school with me or have gone to school there since. And I had a great education at Lamar High School. I'm really grateful for the time I had there. Okay, back to this point. So I relate to this guy's name, but wow. Talk about coming on the extreme on the other side. Of course, if you're following a peacenik, and I'm put that in air quotes, as people might refer to him today, Sam Houston, in his desire to maintain peace with the Indians, which was true all the way through. He wanted to hold that approach. In fact, even after other changes, he was offering opportunities for people to come down to the Huntsville area and for the Indians, for the Comanches to come to the Huntsville area. And, hey, let's talk peace. Let's figure out how to have an economic relationship and make things work. So he doesn't change his mind about that to any extent that I know. I don't know that he ever changes his mind about it. Mirabeau B. Lamar, he becomes president, and it's a lot of the same kind of rhetoric that we hear today for very similar reasons. He's just tired of hearing about frontier families being slaughtered, and he uses that fear, which is, again, not grounded in nothing. There is something going on in the day. He uses that fear to drum up support and then win the presidency, and then gives this speech to the legislature in 1838 in Texas again. So this is our second president speaking, Mirabeau B. Lamar. This is Lamar's speech, in quotes. Has not the white man for centuries furnished him, the indigenous person here, with examples of clemency and kindness? I'll make a few comments on this in just a minute. I'm just going to kind of give it to you right now. Were there any acts of clemency and kindness? Okay, I'm going to make comments on it as we go. Were there any acts of clemency and kindness? Of course there were. But there were also innumerable and every single treaty that was violated. And not just violated partially, but violated in the moment it was signed. Oh, we'll guarantee you this land, we'll guarantee you these rights, and then nobody did it. Sometimes because it wouldn't be ratified by the Senate. Sometimes because they didn't intend to do it from the beginning. They just wanted to get them to sign something and get out of the way so we could make the progress we wanted to make. It's just part of American history. It's part of what happened. And so this statement is myopic at best, maybe just a flat-out lie. But I don't think so. I think he believes it. I think he thinks it's true and says it. So has not the white man for centuries furnished the indigenous person, him, with examples of clemency and kindness? Have not their women and children been protected, and the old and informed been and infirm? He misspelled it. So the infirmed been spared. So let me just pause here and say, there are reports from the people who were in those battles historically in American history with the Native Americans who said that they would count and say, oh, we killed hundreds of warriors who were fighting against us. And in reality, they would count every dead body as a warrior. Women, children, old people, whoever it was. So these are people who were on the ground and fought the battle and said, well, that's not actually true. We killed the men, women, and children and counted them all as if they were warriors. So, I don't believe this line either. I don't know if Mirabeau B. Lamar, the namesake of my very beloved high school, believed it or not. I don't know. But I know he's saying it. So, hey, have we not spared their old and infirm? And when taken in battle, haven't they experienced forbearances and indulgences, which so much assuage the asperities of civilized conflict? In other words, haven't we been kind to them to make it more like a civilized conflict than the barbarities of the West that we had in the past? And he said, they have. And it is precisely because their indulgences have been profitable to their heartless policy that they have persevered in their ancient barbarities. In other words, we're kind, and all that does is give them more room to be cruel to us. That's what he's saying. Now, assigning motives is a dangerous thing at any time because you don't know why people do what they do. But certainly saying the only reason they're still being cruel to us is because we haven't been harsh enough with them. I can understand the argument. Doesn't mean I have to agree with it, but I do understand the argument. So he goes on. This is an extreme. I'm not saying this is normal. I'm not saying this is what everybody would want. It is a part of Texas history. And so you can understand when we hear things today that are presented in the extreme, and it repeats some of the same kind of language that's used in these arguments, that it's not a new thing in Texas. It's not a new thing in our area. The extremes are there. And the extremes can overlook what might be true and would cause us to have to pull back a little. I mean, in this case, well, it is true we violated every treaty with them. So maybe they don't have a reason to trust us. And we should figure out, not by being weak, but we should figure out in the next conflict how to establish a relationship with them so that they could actually start trusting us. If you said that, you would have a slightly different opinion. Now listen to where this, if you say, why are you saying this is so extreme? Haven't gotten to the end yet. Keep listening. So he goes on and says, as long as we continue to act like that, they're just going to continue to bloody the tomahawk. Those are some of the phrases in the work of rapacity and slaughter. And how long shall this, he goes on to say, cruel humanity, this murderous sensibility for the sanguinary savage, meaning the bloodthirsty savage, be practiced in defiance of its tested impolicy, until other oceans of blood, the blood of our wives and children, shall glut their voracious appetite. So, you're making it personal. Your wife, your children, they're the ones next. They're the ones who are going to be killed next. And again, it's not like it hadn't happened. So I understand. I'm not even saying there's no basis for it. But listen to the extreme that he takes it to. Now he says, no, we can't continue down this path. If the wild cannibals of the woods, so now we're labeling them. These are not just other people. These are wild cannibals. That's an exaggeration. There were some cannibals among indigenous peoples. It wasn't a regular practice, but it was sometimes ceremonial and sometimes desperate. But whatever, it's still creepy, right? No matter what you're doing, if you're a cannibal, something's wrong, okay? So I get that. But using that label for all Native Americans in Texas is absurd. So but it's not absurd, because what it does is say we have a right now to treat them worse. We have a right to do whatever we want to do. I mean, after all, they're just cannibals. They're not people like us. If the wild, not human, now wild cannibals of the woods will not desist from their massacres, then they continue to war upon us with the ferocity of tigers and hyenas. Now, again, he's just making a comparison. If we were perfectly rational in the moment, we'd be able to say, well, he's just comparing their behavior with tigers and hyenas. But he just called them wild cannibals. And so bringing up the animals that we hunt and slaughter at the time is obvious. It's obvious where he's going, and that's where he goes. And look, later on, I would say this. I'm not going to make this point later, so I'll just say it right now. If you want to examine your own motivations for holding the views that you hold, you need to consider whether you recognize when people start dehumanizing other people with the labels they give them. If we don't even recognize that, if we're not even willing to admit, oh, you know what? He's not talking about them as if they're fully human anymore. He's using names for them, these beasts, this bestial behavior, these tigers and hyenas, these cannibals, this whatever label you put on them. And I will say this, and it may be a little provocative, but the importance some people I know lend to calling undocumented immigrants illegals is evidence of a potential problem along those lines. I understand some people could use the term because, it's the only one they know. But when we are specific about referring to undocumented immigrants with the recognition that terminology gives to their humanity, I've had people adamantly defend instead referring to those human beings as illegals. And I will say to them, that's dehumanizing. It's minimizing the recognition of the person who has an immigration status, and instead treating that person as if they're nothing more than that single characteristic in the immigration system. And instead of responding with, oh, well, it doesn't matter what you call them, I think they should obey the rules and deport themselves, they say, no, they're illegals. Now, why would that labeling be important if not to dismiss our recognition of the full humanity of someone we want to treat differently than people we actually recognize as bearing the image of God. And that's what we do as Christians. So here we have the idea. I mean, it's the same problem we would have with criminality when we say, oh, he's a felon, he's a criminal, instead of recognizing this is a person who's been convicted of a crime. This is a person who committed a felony. This is a person who's been punished. This is a person who's trying to find a way in society, or this is a person who's really struggling to find a way in society, and we're going to have to continue to punish. All of those are legitimate, but let's treat them like people. Okay, enough parenthetical note. In the middle of Mirabeau B. Lamar's speech to the legislature in Texas upon his presidency, he says, if the wild cannibals of the woods will not desist from their massacres, they continue to war upon us with the ferocity of tigers and hyenas. It is time that we should retaliate their warfare. And then he says this self-contradictorily, but he says, not in the murder of their women and children. Well, it's a good start to the sentence, right? But listen to where it goes. But in the prosecution of an exterminating war upon their warriors, I'm putting that in air quotes because of who they counted as a warrior, which will admit of no compromise and have no termination except in their total extinction or total expulsion. It's a famous line in Texas history. We don't say it very often because we're not exactly proud of it. But there it is. There's nothing but genocide in that line. And there's nothing that excludes women and children from that conclusion. There's no way to exclude them from that conclusion. So this is our history. This is where we came from. Does that make us today evil people because we have this history? Of course not. But it does give us an example of the extremism that emerges when we pull one way and then recognize that that's not working, and it wasn't. We weren't reconciling things on the frontier with the peace approach that Sam Houston was advocating, partially because he couldn't get everybody on board with it to cooperate with it. But whatever it is, you've still got to make stuff work or it doesn't happen. And if it doesn't happen, then the other extreme is going to come up and say, we're going to try it the other way. And so it goes from we're going to be completely peaceable and win these people over with our economic advantages for them, and they'll just want to join our society. Now, there are just all kinds of problems with that I will bring up in a minute because it is an extreme approach. That's fine. I like the peaceful approach, obviously, but it probably wasn't going to work. And then the other extreme approach, it's extinction or expulsion. Those are the two words that are used to describe it. So again, that source, by the way, is Digital History from the University of Houston, and Daisy will create the link on our website if you want to look it up and read that speech. I basically read you the entirety of that speech because it's a speech to the legislature, so it's shorter. So let me point out a couple of elements in each of these. And we're not, this is going to take 2 episodes, I realize now, as we're going through it. But it'll be worth it, I think. We're not staying on Texas history. That's not the point. And we're not staying in the past, not in deep history. We are staying in the past because it's really hard to predict things in the future. But you know what I mean. It's going to be the more recent past or the contemporary world. Anyway, and it's because I want to get to something about us that we need to think about where our mental states are and why we end up doing the kinds of things that we do, unfortunately, without awareness of what motivated it. So let me point out a couple of things in these things. Number one, under Sam Houston, there is a desire to lay a foundation of mutual interest. That seems good. Let's do something that's to everybody's benefit. And again, we recognize Sam Houston as a hero in our history. And we do recognize Lamar. I mean, we have a college named after him. We have high schools named after him. We recognize him. But there is also a little recognition that, calling for the extinction or extermination of people groups, not necessarily a shining moment for our history, right? So there's a little taint on that on Lamar because of that. So anyway, here's the point. In Houston's speech, you can see the desire to lay a foundation of mutual interest and a desire to maintain security with an army that's well-disciplined, that's valiant and well-disciplined, and that would not behave in a way that would be condemned by Christendom, and what he would say is the way Texans ought to behave. And as you see things go forward in Texan history, the establishment of the Texas Rangers doesn't come with some great policing action, some investigation of criminal conduct of this kind or that kind. The Texas Rangers are the people who, under Lamar and subsequent administrations, are roaming the plains of Texas slaughtering Indians. That's what they do. That's where the Texas Rangers come from. Again, you can read it in Empire of the Summer Moon to hear about where it comes from, and you can think whatever you want of that, and how it happened. But it's a pretty brutal enterprise, and his desire, Sam Houston's desire, was to make sure that the people who were representing us with force had civility, valiance, that they were defenders of us, but it was in discipline. And that's basically the opposite. I'm not attacking the Texas Rangers. Everybody in Texas is proud of what the Texas Rangers provide for us and the quality of criminal, law enforcement and all that kind of stuff. And still am. But I mean, going back to the history of it, it wasn't exactly established under major discipline. They just ran out and did the stuff they did and then took on the name of Texas Rangers later, as I understand it. You can work on all that stuff on your own later on. Lamar's speech, Mirabeau Lamar's speech. First of all, there's a lionized depiction of how Europeans treated Native Americans. The absurdity. Oh, we've done nothing but be kind and generous, and they have returned nothing but ferocity and brutality. I think there's just a myopia there that's hard to ignore. We don't like to see our flaws. We don't like to see when we've done something that's wrong. We don't like the idea that we would bomb something that we shouldn't have bombed. So let's just not consider it as a possibility. And so again, and I said this when we were talking about rationality and the difference between being reasonable or rational and then rationalizing, that you shouldn't draw the conclusion you want to draw and then look for arguments to support it. We need to see the evidence honestly and be willing to confront ourselves with things that make us uncomfortable. If you haven't done that lately, if you're not uncomfortable with some of the political conclusions that are drawn on your side of the aisle, then you're just not paying attention to the world, or you're rationalizing things away, because both sides are very flawed right now. And it's not hard to see if you just step back and look at it honestly. Put on your glasses and be able to see past the end of your nose, and you'll realize both sides are pretty flawed right now. So what are we supposed to do about that? Well, my suggestion is, as we work through all this, that we examine ourselves better, that we, as individuals, look at ourselves and give a better examination to the way we're taking in information and what we're doing with that information, which I'll get to at the end of both of these episodes, apparently, instead of just this one. So anyway, there's a look at Houston's speech, a look at Lamar's speech, lionizing, by being myopic and not seeing the flaws in our own people, and then assigning motives to someone else. Well, our mercy is the thing that's inviting greater ferocity from them. Not, by the way, just not, and this one's obvious. I know that pretty much no one in their day that I'm aware of, I'm sure there were individuals that were arguing for this. In fact, I'm sure there were clergy who did argue for this. But nobody in the political world was making the argument for this. The motive for a lot of the ferocity of the fighting that was going on in the frontier, for a lot of the brutalities, as we would identify them, and they're brutalities, terrorizing acts on the frontier by the indigenous people who were here, a lot of that was motivated by them facing the end, no matter what happened, the end of their way of life. No way were they going to be able to live off of the land the way they lived before. That was just going to go away. And if they peaceably settled and became wealthy and prosperous participants in the expanding westward movement of the United States or of the Republic of Texas at the time, if they agreed to be part of that, agreeing to be part of that would be saying, we no longer want to have the way of life we've had for hundreds of years. I'm in favor of persuading them for that, because no matter what you do, when civilizations confront each other, when frontiers meet, someone's culture influences the other. They both influence each other, but someone's becomes dominant, and then the culture changes, and cultures go away because of that. That's part of the reality of human history. Nobody can get away from that. If the motivation then is our way of life is worth defending to the death, then it doesn't matter how much cruelty or mercy you show. You're going to have the same pushback because a people are looking at what they see as their genocide. understandably so. That doesn't even enter the picture or the discussion in what's going on in early Texas, in the Texas Republic. Again, I'm not saying they could have. I don't know that they could have seen that. But there were clergy supposedly making arguments similar to that at the time. I haven't done enough research to be convinced that that's absolutely true, but there are cases made that may be the case. Anyway, I'll figure that out later, and we'll talk about it another day. Here's this, though. He's assigning motives, not a great thing. He's making the threat personal. I mean, you got to bring it home. It doesn't matter if other people are dying. People will still say, let's try to do the right thing. But if your wife and your children are going to be slaughtered eventually, they're coming into your homes, then suddenly, maybe we should be violent. Maybe we should do something to completely wipe them out. The dehumanization that takes place, cannibals, the ferocity of tigers and hyenas. And then finally, the offer of the final solution, which is, unsurprisingly, let's either totally expel them or totally destroy them. Extinction or expulsion. By the way, after saying the words, not in the murder of their women and children. That's a hypocritical sentence. That's not possible. You either are including the destruction of their women and children, or you're not going to wish for their extinction or total expulsion. The two do not go hand in hand. So you kind of know it's wrong when you're starting it out. So, those shortcomings, they're worth mentioning. There were genuine brutalities. Houston may not have addressed those as directly as he should have. And there were lots of motivations for the Indians in Texas, as they were referred to at the time, not to cooperate with Western European expansion. They didn't want to see the end of their lives, and they didn't have any treaty examples where we had kept our word. And I'm saying that as a white European historically person, The intolerance of frontier families and I mean that when I say that's not a redundancy. The intolerance of frontier families for the tolerance of the raiding bands and the tribes that had been terrorizing them would tell Sam Houston and a lot of people in Texas, you can try for peace, but you're not going to have peace on the frontier. These families are at war, and something has to happen more than just offering an economic exchange. So, there are shortcomings going both directions. I get it. There are. Obviously, we would prefer a peaceful approach over extinction or expulsion, but there were extremes going on in both directions, and those kinds of extremes show up in our world as well. And the extremes show up not because everything's going well. When everything's going well, people don't want to hear somebody up with foamed mouth trying to raise the anxiety level of the crowd. When things are going well, people just want to be left alone to make their business prosper and use their swimming pool. They're not trying to start a war. That's the last thing in the world they want. They don't want their kids to grow up and be drafted into some kind of conflict. When things are easily exacerbated, it's because something's wrong. Somebody is dissatisfied, and the thing that exacerbates anxiety in our culture right now is obvious. And so obviously there are discomforts in this way and that way, and there are disagreements that we have about values of this kind and that kind. But the thing that's really exacerbating everything else, making it worse than everything else and making everything apocalyptic is not just the value on the other side, but a sincerely felt intense fear of the opposite extreme. Not, hey, I disagree on these values and we've got to have an election and decide which way we're going to go, but if you win, if they accomplish what they want to do, we're all going to die. We're all going to be destroyed. Now, at this point, I will pause and say, I do believe the extremes are on both sides. And I mean by the extreme, not just there are crazy right people who are trying to do things that are outlandish, and there are crazy left people who are trying to do things that are outlandish. I don't just mean that. I mean the extremes on both sides where there are people on the right who believe that the left is going to bring the destruction of America in the next 10 years. And there are people on the left who believe that the right is going to bring the destruction of America within the next 10 years. Well, it's not hard to see from that kind of bifurcation again of the country into these two polar opposites where we have to oppose everyone else using any means necessary or we're all going to die. That kind of approach is not where we should be and not where we're going to find peace. I wasn't going to mention this, but I will say it. We had a guest speaker in our chapel about a week ago as I'm recording this, Elizabeth Newman, who came to speak, who wrote a book called Kingdom of Rage. And it's about that. It's about those extremes and how they get fomented and how that's used. She has expertise and history as a director of counterterrorism in 2 presidential administrations, Republican presidential administrations. So she knows what she's talking about in counterterrorism. And she's got the bona fides. I mean, she is a conservative thinker. She loves the country and she loves security, and she's been involved in providing security for the country for decades. So a person with all of those credentials is just pointing out that the real danger in the society is exacerbating those fears to the point where we believe that even violence is justified in being exercised against the other extreme. So if somebody's far enough on the right, the left will think, I'm talking about people who are brought into this level of fear, they will think, yeah, we should even use violence to stop that person. So think of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And there are people on the right who will look at the far side on the left and say, we should justify the use of violence against those people, even if you're not committing the violence. Hence, you think of the death of Alex Preddy and Renee Good. The response of a lot of people on the right, people who are otherwise very reasonable, is, well, they shouldn't have been protesting. As if we just shoot people for protesting. This is not a rational response, but the reason it's not rational is because we're already in these extreme corners where we see the far opposite side as an inherent existential danger to our entire existence as a people who can do anything good whatsoever. And that kind of fear is just not helpful. And so what I want to do is talk about where some of that fear shows up in our culture right now, in the discussions that we have right now, again, on both sides, because it's ugly on both sides, where that fear shows up, and not try to fix it, not try to say, well, that policy's right, or that policy's right, or that one's wrong, or that one's wrong. I have my understandings of these things, and I do have a prejudice in one direction or the other. And it's not hard to figure out what that is. I'm a very conservative person, but I'm also unhappy with a lot of the things we're doing right now. I get all that. That'll creep out. Some of that'll show up. Fine. It's not fine. I will work on that not being the point, because the point for me is not that, legitimately. The point for me is that when we're so far to the right, we think everybody on the left ought to die or leave. And when we're so far on the left, we think everybody on the right ought to die or leave, then we're wrong. And we need to examine ourselves and figure out what on earth went wrong, not with everybody else. What on earth went wrong with me? Where did I lose my path? And see if we can get back on the path. So that's our goal, and we're going to pick it up in the next episode with a desire to look at a couple of more extremes for the purpose of examining ourselves and becoming better.
Thanks for joining us for Coffee with Creamer. Your cup of coffee may be finished, but we are not. Come back next week for a refill as we sit down to examine a new set of ideas and cultural issues. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or visit our website at barrycreamer.com. Until next time, keep your mug hot and your mind sharp.